So this is the last day of the House of Lords before we recess for Easter. It's only just dawned on me as the week's gone on that the House of Commons was empty, so they've had a longer recess and they were off all this week. What we've been doing in the House of Lords this week is basically trying to shove through as much legislation as possible, as I've described before, because the Queen's speech is approaching. So just to explain a little bit about the process, at the Queen's speech, the Queen reads out the legislative programme for the year, and it will contain some pieces of legislation that haven't started yet, that were announced last year, that we re-announced, like the Online Safety Bill, but there will be new pieces of legislation introduced as well, and some pieces of legislation will just be quietly dropped. So there was a question yesterday by some Labour peers, which was quite funny, which was to say, in the 2019 Queen's speech, you said you're bringing in an employment bill. Where is it? What happened to that? And the minister has replied just kind of like, nod. I'm not saying you want that piece of legislation or not, but they were using the P&O thing to say they could have been defended by that legislation. But the point is, it was announced with a flurry, disappeared. There's some speculation at the moment as to whether the Academic Freedom Bill will ever re-emerge. So I keep hearing it's either been dropped because Gavin Williamson is no longer the Education Minister, and that can happen. There's no minister there to champion it. Or will it re-emerge with somebody else? So there's all of this kind of thing going on. There's some important things to note. I think that it looks obvious now that there's going to be quite a few small pieces of legislation of pieces of change that the Conservatives couldn't get through because the House of Lords blocked them. One of those being, for example, those kind of protests that relate directly to gluing yourself to the radiator or a tunnel or whatever the Extinction Rebellion types are doing at the moment. And a short, sharp, targeted piece of legislation like that, whether you agree with it or not, it will probably have popular support, will not be opposed, whereas them trying to get it in under cover without really a democratic accountability with the police and crime bill backfired on them, but it will come back. And that's their job as the government to do what they say they're going to do in the manifesto, whether we like it or not. One indication of where a mess, you get into a mess on legislation, was the conversion therapy bill. So originally it was announced in a Queen's speech. That was under lobbying. The Conservatives thought, oh, this is like great, we can be seen to be a champion of lesbian and gay rights. Conversion therapy, if you think about, as we traditionally understand it, is that people have cruelly tried people, somebody used the word torture this morning, to stop people denounce their sexuality, or that you are forced, in extreme examples of evangelical Christians, for example, that they won't let you be gay. So of course the Conservatives just kind of excitedly announced it at Queen's speech. Then Liz Truss recognised as the Equalities Minister at some point this might be a bit mad, and that actually it was going to be used to attack those people who work with people with gender dysphoria. So she wanted to drop it and hinted that. 2 high-profile LGBT civil servants resigned. She then said, oh no, okay, I'll bring it back in. They announced it again at the Queen's speech last year. They spent all year humming and hawing and putting it off, because the more they've thought about it, presumably, the more they've realised that this will actually be, this is partly the gender wars, it's partly a Stonewall-sponsored bill with people who like Stonewall, and also, by the way, will be used to criminalise anybody who wants to talk to a young person who's gender dysphoric and say, maybe you aren't a boy, or maybe you're just fed up with being a girl, but that's not the same as being a boy, or any kind of intervention like that could be criminalised and treated as conversion therapy. And so they kind of do that. And so at the weekend, the government very sensibly said, we were actually not bringing forward the conversion therapy bill, and it got leaked. And in the leak, they basically spent a lot of time saying, we know there'll be a backlash, but it's important we explain this, this and this. 3 hours after the leak, Number 10 said, oh, there's been a backlash. Of course we'll bring it in. We'll bring it in, but we won't have the trans bit. Which, of course, keeps nobody happy, because now the trans community can say that they've been discriminated against. Actually, you don't need a conversion therapy bill for lesbian and gay people because it's not a major feature of society. You don't need a new piece of legislation. If somebody's trying to torture you from being lesbian or gay, you go to the police and you get them arrested, and there's a law. You don't need a specific law. And so it's just a complete mess. As a consequence of all that, everyone has pulled out of the government's announced big conference on gender and LGBTQ issues, and that's now been cancelled. But it should never have happened, and it was one of those things that got announced again in the Queen's speech, part of their legislative. We're going to have this big conference, being like the COP26 of gender equalities, and they have basically walked into a complete mess on the gender issue. But I suppose what I'm saying is, from the point of view of Inside the Lords, that legislation is used to virtue signal. All the time they announce things, they then suddenly think, do we really need a law on this? They get trapped, they feel they have to do it, and you get pieces of legislation that just should never meet the statute. It's a complete abuse of power, and it means that we put all sorts of laws that we shouldn't have. That's where we're at. Another interesting thing that happened this week on the rushing things through was that it was announced that the report stage and the third reading, which you don't necessarily have to understand, but the end of a bill, of the elections bill, would all happen on one day after Easter. And two Labour peers stood up, kind of well-established backbenchers, but used to be government ministers in their day, and absolutely lambasted the Conservative Party and said, how dare you push through this, and this is about robbing people of their votes, the most important constitutional changes on election reform, and you pushed it through. And all the time I was looking at the minister, and he's like smiling quietly. Ooh. And then eventually the Labour front bench stood up and said, actually, we did agree to this through what's called the usual channels, i.e. the back channels where all the parties get together. We did agree with this because we thought it was a good idea to try and get it through. So the Labour backbenchers looked shamefaced, the government minister smiled benignly, looked through, and I did think that was rather amusing. But it also shows you that what you see on the face of the chamber is not what's really going on, because all the time there's horse trading going on. People say, if I do this, if we let this amendment through, we'll drop this one, and so on. That happens all the time, and I don't even know it happens usually. I mean, why would I be told? But you therefore suddenly think, oh, those amendments have disappeared. I thought they'd really push it, and they don't come because they've agreed to accept some gain over there. Again, not a democratic way, even an undemocratic house, but just in general, not a good way for legislation to be passed through. There's a punitive bit to this as well, which was the idea was that straight after Easter there would be 1 week in which you finish off all legislation, because there's so much ping-ponging going on, particularly on the Borders bill, because actually the House of Lords does represent that that wing of society that basically just does not understand why anybody would stop anyone coming into the UK if they say they're a refugee, who are really anti-borders, who are basically anti-nation state, and it's always had a bit of a Brexit, leave versus remain sort of vibe to it. Anyone who doesn't go along with the Nationality and Borders bill, some of which, by the way, is, I don't like, the outsourcing of refugees to Rwanda and all that seems completely ridiculous. But nonetheless, the disdain with which the Lords treat it is, if you don't agree with us, you're a xenophobic, racist, vile person who wants refugees to drown in the sea. And they've obviously hijacked, in some ways, the Ukrainian refugee thing to give them a bolster. So they keep rejecting, they keep voting through their own amendments, sending them back to Commons, and it's going to go on for a while, I think. So the way that the governments have dealt with it is say, well, we come back for a week after Easter, you then think we're going to be prorogued and you can all go on holiday before the Queen's speech on the 10th of May. But no, they've now just announced they've added in extra days so that they're going to say, no, we're going to force you, the Lords, we're not going to be bounced. And actually they're right in a way, aren't they? Because I don't like what the government does, but they've got an 80-seat majority. That's the deal. And therefore you can argue against them in some ways, but you can't bounce them in an unelected house into doing things totally that they don't want to do. That the voters will have to hold them to account, nobody else. Finally, so I'm going to have some time away from the Lords, or a week and a half, but I'm coming. I'm going to put all my energy into preparing for the next legislative period at the Lords angle, but also very much working through all of the issues surrounding the war in Ukraine. I still said, as I said last week, that there is a danger that people think this is just another war, trundles on, we've almost got a bit war weary, how many atrocities can you cope with on the news? Maybe it'll just go away, will it go away? And I think the international significance of it sometimes can be missed in that, and I understand why, because people are so worried about cost of living, worried about facing huge bills up down the line on energy, but everything else. I mean, there's a genuine fear of that, isn't there? And rightly so too. But I think this war is going to reshape the world, and I just think it's important that we understand and get to grips with that. So on the April the 20th, we've got a meeting in which we're going to talk about what the implications are for the war in terms of what the West means. Is the West distinct from Western values? What it means for the EU. People say, oh great, the war has united the West, has united Europe. Actually, there's massive tensions growing all the time. And I think that it was interesting what's happened in the Hungarian elections, because the Orban victory, which was substantial, was immediately greeted as letting the side down, letting the Western side down, rather than a democratic victory for the Hungarian people who voted for who they wanted, whether you like Orban or not. And so much for people's commitment to sovereignty from NATO countries. They immediately wanted to attack the sovereignty of Hungary because they didn't fall in line. We've got the French elections coming up. There's huge tension, which is looking very interesting to say the least. Le Pen doing very well, Macron looking shaky, but we don't know where we are. Germany's split asunder, it seems to me, about their attitude to Ukraine. All sorts of things like that. What I'm saying is that discussion about what this Ukraine war is going to do to Europe is hugely important. It's not even really being discussed in Parliament, because in a way they can, presumably they're supplying arms on the one hand, a bit of virtue signalling, but I think that deeper significance is one which we citizens of the UK need to get to grips with. So I hope I'll see you on April the 20th, Central London. It'll be advertised all over social media. Tell everybody, tell your friends, come along, let's have that discussion. And we're going to have a third in the series of our Ukraine events sometime after Easter, further after Easter in May or something, about the media coverage of the war as well. So I think that's an interesting thing to reflect on. So hopefully I'll see you then. I can't wait to get out of the Lords. Last night I was actually having a drink with a friend inside when I was waiting to vote on various things, and it was a bit like the last day of term. But for me, I suddenly thought, I do my job in the House of Lords, but I do not feel at home. I feel at home when I'm talking to people who are really interested in politics. Although I think I've achieved a few things. I was even congratulated on the building safety bill by all sides in the debate, which was quite nice. But in the end, thank God, legislation's not really my bag. I'll just do it to the best of my ability. But real politics doesn't happen in there, it happens outside.